And now, marine weather around Alaska.
All right, up first, today's sea ice analysis. And as expected, with all the cold air that's come down here into the Bering Sea, ice has been shifting southward and a little bit to the southwest, almost to St. Matthew Island out there now. Now well south of Nunivak Island, Kuskokwim Bay covered there. And now finally some ice showing up in Bristol Bay once again. But that's going to be about it with the warm air coming back up. Things will start to push back to the north a little bit starting late tomorrow. And for tonight, here comes that storm system pushing northeastward here. Wind or snow changes to rain for the Pribilof Islands, with rain back along the front there to the central Aleutians, and increasing clouds along the southwest coast. Cold high pressure here in the interior areas. Coldest areas will be the clear areas with the lightest winds, of course, as winds stay gusty here along the North Gulf Coast, south central Alaska areas like Resurrection Bay. But winds start to come down Kodiak Island there with mostly clear skies. Snow showers across the southeast coast there, with some areas picking up possibly as much as 6 inches. For tomorrow, snow showers continue for the Panhandle, and gusty northeast winds here along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, mostly in the channeled areas there, and starting to pick the winds up a little bit there for the northern southeast coast. Cold high pressure in the interior keeps temperatures below zero from the Arctic coast right on down to at least the Alaska Range and on into the Copper River Basin areas. Snow and blowing snow here, pushing into the southwest interior with the worst conditions from about Cape Newenham up along the Yukon Delta coast to St. Lawrence Island. Wet and windy for the Pribilofs, as well as the Aleutians with that next front coming in. And that takes off to the north here mostly, and then edges eastward a little bit, but the warm front just spread more snow or rain and snow in toward the southwest coast, with some areas of snow up across the Seward Peninsula to possibly, staying, not quite making the northwest coast there, as this high starts to slide off to the east. It's clear and cold on the east side. More clouds, milder conditions as you head west here. It stays wet for Adak and Atka again, may pick up another inch or two of precipitation there. Kind of a break here for the Alaska Peninsula, as well as Kodiak Island, and strong winds about to, your cold Arctic air blasting into the northern Panhandle here as this high slides off to the east and the snow showers take off to the southeast. And for the marine forecast here on the south coast, tomorrow, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. North to east winds 25 to 35 knots for the north coast. Gale warnings, Lynn Canal, north winds 35 knots with 10-foot seas. Stevens Passage, Clarence Strait, southeast winds at 20. And then for the day Friday, for the south coast here, gale warnings, north to northeast wind, or north winds 35 to 40 knots. Even stronger gales here in the central coast out of the northeast 40 to 45 knots, and north to northeast winds 30 to 40 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, sustained north winds 40 knots with gusts to 55 knots. Gale warnings also for Stevens Passage, north at 40 knots, and Clarence Strait, north winds at 30 knots. Prince William Sound, north winds 25 knots tomorrow. Eastern North Gulf Coast, especially blowing out of the Copper River Delta, look for sustained northerlies of 45 knots. Otherwise, northerly gales here for the western North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings also Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, northwest, 35 to 40 knots. North winds at 20 knots for Cook Inlet. And for Friday, north to northeast winds 10 to 20 knots for the inlet here, and north at about 20 for Kamishak Bay. Northwest at 25 for the Barren Islands. For the North Gulf Coast, north winds coming down to 15 to 20 knots, and wind subsiding to 15 knots out of the north for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island tomorrow, not quite as windy, but still a little brisk there with northwest winds at 30 knots. South winds 25 knots coming into the Alaska Peninsula, and kind of a more variable lighter condition here to the east, and then northeast at 10 for Bristol Bay. Southwest 15 for the bay up here, Bristol Bay on Friday. Alaska Peninsula, south to southwest, 15 to 20 knots. Kodiak Island, northwest winds, 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south winds, 30 knots. South 35 for Adak, Atka out to Amchitka, where they could be as high as 40 knots. Kiska to Shimia, east winds, 30 knots. Then for the day on Friday, here for the western Aleutian areas west of Adak, we've got south to southeast winds at 25 to 30 knots. Good southerly gales continue here for Adak and Atka at 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds at 25 to 35 knots. Along the southwest coast, gale warnings tomorrow. Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, east at 40 knots, south at 40 knots for St. Matthew Island. Southerly gales for the Pribilos at 35 knots and southeast 35 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta. And then for the day on Friday, southwest coast, south winds 20 knots. Milder southerly winds all the way up to St. Lawrence Island at about 20 knots, but east at 25 for Norton Sound. Pribilof, St. Matthew Island, south winds at 30 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, we've got east winds 15 to 20 knots forecast. Otherwise, the central and western coastal areas west at 15 with brisk wind advisories for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast up to 30 knots. And then on Friday, we've got west-southwest 15 to 25 for the eastern coast there. Central coast swinging around to the east at about 15 knots with brisk wind advisories here for the western Arctic coast, east 25. And for the Chukchi Sea, east to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots.